Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today, in celebration of my 10 years on BookTube, I'm going to be telling you about my 10 favourite authors of all time. Now, if you watched yesterday's video about my favourite 10 books of all time, you will not be surprised to hear that while I have created a top 10, there are also several honourable mentions because I'm not good at making lists short. So, oh well, we'll all live with that. So I have 10 favourite authors and 4 honourable mentions because of course I do. There are obviously quite a lot of authors on this list who had a book mentioned in yesterday's video, but there are also some authors who didn't. You know, authors who I love overall and I love their body of work, but there isn't like one of their books that would necessarily make it onto a top favourite books of all time for me. Out of yesterday's list, this list does contain quite a lot of 19th century British authors because a lot of them are the authors who kind of got me into reading as a teenager and got me into loving books. So I feel very like emotionally attached to them as authors, and I love their books a lot, and they're often the authors I've read the most by as well. But anyway, let me stop rambling and start off with my 4 honourable mentions. My first honourable mention is the amazing Sarah Waters, who is a wonderful writer of historical fiction. She has written 6 novels. I've read all of them. 3 of them are set in the Victorian period, 3 of them are set in the 20th century, and they all look at history in a really interesting way with fascinating themes, fantastic characterization, and such good writing. I love the way she writes. Some of her books are very, very pacey. Some of them are a bit slower paced, but in general, I just think she's a wonderful, wonderful writer. So I'm holding up here Tipping the Velvet, which is probably my favourite book by her, although maybe it's Affinity. I change my mind every time I think about it. I'm pretty sure the last time I said on this channel what my favourite Sarah Waters book was, which was only like a month ago, I said Affinity, but today it's Tipping the Velvet, which is an incredible Victorian set coming of age story that I absolutely love. Another honourable mention on my list is the romance writer Emily Henry. Feels kind of ridiculous that I don't have any physical copies of her books to show you, considering she is one of my favourite authors slash an honourable mention in my favourite authors. But I've listened to everything I've read by Emily Henry so far on audiobook, and I have really enjoyed listening to her work on audiobook, so I think that is probably how I'll continue to consume it. I really love Emily Henry a lot. I have read 5 out of her 6 romance novels. I haven't read her newest one, Great Big Beautiful Life, although I am very excited to do so, and hopefully will quite soon. I haven't read any of her YA. I believe she wrote a few YA books before she moved into writing adult romance, but I would be kind of interested to at some point, and I absolutely love her romance books so much. For me, Emily Henry writes like just the kind of romance books, rom-coms, whatever you want to call them, that I like, because the love story is obviously very important and the love story drives the plot, but actually there's so much else going on beyond the love story, and the life stuff and the balance of like the family and friendship plot lines and the work plot lines, and often like the bookish plot lines with the love story are so good. And I love that about her books a lot, as well as finding them really compelling, really funny, really moving, very emotional, and just generally fantastic. I think my favourite Emily Henry book is possibly You and Me on Vacation, which is also called People We Meet on Vacation, I think, in the US, but was You and Me on Vacation here. I love that book a lot. But I also really, really love Book Lovers. And in general, I just think her books are fantastic. So anyway, another honourable mention I have is E.M. Forster, who is a fantastic classic author, early 20th century author whose books I really, really love. So I have read all of E.M. Forster's novels, and I've also read a bit of his non-fiction and a few of his short stories. And in general, I just really like his work. I think he's very varied, very, very interesting. And he writes about class and society in the first few decades of the 20th century in such an interesting way. And he also writes a lot of kind of unexpected love stories and stories you find quite hard to predict. And he also writes quite a lot about like love that crosses social boundaries in some way. My favourite book by him is Maurice, which I'm holding up here, which is a novel he wrote in the 1910s but wasn't published until after his death in the 1970s because it is a gay love story, and a book about being gay in the Edwardian period. And although Forster showed it to a few friends during his lifetime, he never felt that there was any way that he could publish it. And it's so fantastic, and it's so interesting and moving and powerful, and great. But also I just recommend I was about to say I recommend everything by Ian Forster, but I don't recommend The Longest Journey, which is not the best. But otherwise, he's a very good author, and I definitely recommend his books. My final honourable mention is Diane Setfield. You may recognise The 13th Tale from yesterday's video, because this is one of my 10 favourite books of all time. The reason why Diane Setfield is an honourable mention rather than like in my top 10 favourite authors of all time is really, I think, because she's only written 3 books, and maybe she'll write more one day, but I find it quite hard to compare like my love for an author who's written a handful of books to my love for an author who's written a really big body of work, of which I love a lot. And I also feel like my love for The 13th Tale is degrees higher than my love for Once Upon a River, which is degrees higher again than my love for Belmont and Black, though I do think they're all incredible books. Anyway, Diane Setfield writes amazing, fantastic, rich historical fiction with interesting characters, compelling settings, and a real like strong sense of atmosphere that I absolutely love. I love the way she writes about books and storytelling, and I just love the way she writes, and the twists and turns of her plots are so good. And as I said yesterday, The 13th Tale is one of my favourite books of all time, and my favourite book not from the 19th century, and it is just great. Talking of authors who don't have a massive body of work, you may notice the absence of any Bronte sisters in my top 10 favourite authors of all time, which does feel slightly wrong considering how much I love the books by the Brontes. My favourite book by a Bronte sister is Wuthering Heights, but to say that Emily Bronte is one of my favourite authors when she only wrote one book, I find that like strange, even though it's one of my favourite books ever. So I don't know, anyway, you don't need to know the rationale behind this list, do you? Number 10 in my top 10 favourite authors of all time is the amazing Thomas Hardy. I love Thomas Hardy's books a lot. I think he's a fantastic, fantastic author, a wonderful Victorian writer, known often for his nature writing, but personally I'm not there for the nature writing. I'm not there for the way Hardy describes the landscape. I'm there for the way Hardy describes the effect of landscape on people. And Hardy writes so well about people, about class, about marriage, about messy love stories, about social mobility, about the unfairness of Victorian society and the way that it is changing, but not enough. I love his themes and I love his stories. And I think he's an incredible, incisive novelist. But I also think he's an incredible poet. And obviously yesterday's list and this list is very dominated by novels. The main thing I read is novels, and I love novels a lot, and most of my favourite authors are primarily novelists, although some of the authors on this list do write short stories as well. But Thomas Hardy is not only my 10th favourite novelist, but also my like absolute favourite #1 poet. Thomas Hardy wrote a lot of poetry, most of it, interestingly, not in the Victorian period when he was writing his novels. A lot of his poetry was written in the 20th century, by which time he had stopped novel writing. I really recommend Thomas Hardy's poetry. I think it's wonderful. He writes about grief in fantastic ways, and he belongs, you know, as one of my favourite authors of all time for his amazing novels, but also for his poetry. My favourite novel by Thomas Hardy is Jude the Obscure, but I wouldn't recommend starting with this one or necessarily reading it unless you are emotionally ready for it, because it's so grim, but it's so good. But I would maybe recommend Far From the Madding Crowd or The Woodlanders or The Return of the Native as stronger places to start with his books. Also, while I'm here talking about Thomas Hardy, Jen the Librarian is hosting a read-along in publication order of Thomas Hardy's books starting in June, starting this month. And I really recommend going along and joining in if you want to read some more Thomas Hardy. So I'll leave some links to that down below, just while I remember and have a Thomas Hardy book in my hand. At number 9, my 9th favourite author is Banani Oshimoto, who is a fantastic Japanese writer. I know I spoke about her and this collection of stories, well, 2 stories, Kitchen, yesterday. But I just really love Banani Oshimoto. She's a fantastic writer. Kitchen is my favourite thing by her, but if you feel like reading a novel rather than 2 short stories, I would really recommend Goodbye Zagumi, which is a fantastic, fantastic novel that I think about so often and that I really should reread sometime. Banani Oshimoto writes really, really interestingly about memory, about love, about messy relationships, about being a young woman of a particular age where life is kind of changing and you're sort of finding yourself. I love her themes. I love the way she writes. I love the sort of like gentle philosophy of her books, as well as the rich characterization. I love the way she she writes about food. I love the way she writes about grief. There's just so much that I love in Banani Oshimoto's books. So I have read, I think, 13 books by Banani Oshimoto, some of which are short story collections, some of which are novels. I think that is basically everything you can read by her that's been translated into English. In fact, I love Banani Oshimoto so much that when I went to Japan on holiday a few years ago, I bought 2 of her books in Japanese, even though I cannot read Japanese and have no intention of learning Japanese, just because I wanted to own them in their original form. At number 8, we have the amazing author Emily Syndra Mandel, whose books I think are incredible, and she's also a very, very versatile, varied writer. There's something about her writing style that I really, really love. It's very, very precise, in a way that I just think is fantastic. Like, it's never overdone, but it's also like just perfectly poised. And I also love her stories, the things that she's interested in and the tales that she tells. So I'm holding up here The Lola Quartet, which is probably my favourite book by her, although I do also really, really love Station 11 a lot. But I thought I would hold up The Lola Quartet because I feel like many people have heard of Station 11 and a lot fewer people have heard of The Lola Quartet. Station 11 is an post-apocalyptic novel that is both like heart-wrenching and hopeful and just generally amazing. The Lola Quartet is much more realist and is a story of various people who are kind of looking back on their high school days when they were connected by a band they were in at school. And I just think it's wonderful, and talking about it's making me want to reread it because it's been so many years since I read this one. I have read all of Emily Syndra Mandel's books and I think they're all incredible. I think if you want to try some of her books, if you're interested in more realist stuff, try The Lola Quartet. If you fancy something apocalyptic, try Station 11. They are both fantastic, but then everything she writes is fantastic. At number 7, I have Kazuo Ishiguro, who is another absolute favourite author of mine. Obviously, that's why he's on this list. There are so many things I love about Ishiguro. I love the way he writes. I love the way he plays with memory. That's often a really big theme in his books, and I feel like the way he writes about it is fantastic. But one of the things I love most about his books is how varied they are. Some of them are historical fiction, some of them are speculative science fiction, some of them are completely different things. Some of them do very odd things that I wouldn't go with if another author was trying it. But I also love that while all his books are very, very different to each other in sort of concept and premise, you can often see a kind of thematic through line between them, which is just something I really, really like. I'm holding up here The Remains of the Day, which is my favourite novel by him. I think it is truly amazing. A fantastic work of historical fiction set during the 1950s and 1930s. But I would also hugely recommend Never Let Me Go, which is a more kind of speculative novel. I don't want to say too much about it because it is a novel that is quite interesting to go into without knowing anything about it, but just know that it is incredible. Those are the 2 I'd recommend starting with, and in general I just think he is a wonderful, wonderful writer. At number 6, I have Natasha Pulley, who is the last living author on this list. I love her books a lot. She actually, like Ishiguro, is another author who is quite varied. She has written a lot of historical fiction, but she also has written one work of science fiction, The Mars House, and her most recent book, The Hymn to Dionysus, is historical in a way. It's a Greek myth retelling, but it's also very, very heavily magical, and much more surreal in a way, I suppose, than her previous books. I love so many things about Natasha Pulley's books. I love the way she writes. There's something about her writing style I just find so completely immersive. I've mentioned before that I'm not a very visual reader. I'm not a very visual person. I don't generally have, like, images in my mind when I read. That's not something that happens to me most of the time. But it happens to me more when I read Natasha Pulley than when I read anything else. And I get like little glimpses and little freeze frames in my mind in a way that I don't most of the time when I'm reading. I also love her characterization, which is always very, very complicated. There's often like quite dislikable characters and characters you disapprove of, but you come to understand them as people. And I think that works really well. I love the complexities of her books and the themes that she looks at. And I find her a very, very interesting writer. I feel like she's one of those novelists who like ticks all my bookish boxes, and I can understand why her books are not for everyone. Like, they're quite weird and they're quite quirky and whimsical, and they often have a really like odd balance of really, really dark stuff and very wacky, humorous stuff. But I love that personally, and it really works for me, and I think her books are amazing. At number 5, I have Agatha Christie, who is an absolute favourite author of mine. It was quite fun putting this list together because I feel like 5 years ago, or even like 2 years ago, I'm not sure I would have said that Agatha Christie was like top 5 authors, but actually I think she is. I have now read a lot of her books. There's only one author who I have read more books by than Agatha Christie, and we're going to talk about him very soon. But I have read, like, I did work it out quite recently, somewhere around 38, 39 books by her. And I just love her writing a lot. She was a 20th century crime writer who wrote just so many amazing, incredible murder mysteries. And her characterization is just amazing. The way that she has created so many characters across so many books, but they all feel really complicated, really psychologically interesting. I also love her plots and the way she crafts her stories. I love that although she wrote so many books, she does often make them quite different. I'm holding up here And Then There Were None, which is my favourite book by her, a really compelling, very, very dark thriller that I think is incredible. But I've also read a lot of her Poirot series. Me and my husband Nick have been working our way through Poirot in publication order, and we're really, really, really enjoying that. I'll leave a video down below where we talk about that in more detail and our experiences with Agatha Christie. I've just loved all the Agatha Christie that I've read, and she's an author who I've read a lot of over the past few years and just really, really enjoyed reading a lot of. I listen to most of her books on audiobook, and me and Nick often listen to them together, which is really, really nice as well. And so that's kind of like elevated the Agatha Christie experience, I suppose. And yeah, I just think she's an incredible writer. Okay, we're now into the top 4, who are my favourite 4 authors of all time. And yes, they're all 19th century authors. There's no surprise there, I guess. I feel like I should say as well that the authors I've placed in like 2nd, 3rd and 4th position are basically all like 2nd place jointly. Like, I love all of them equally, really. And I've kind of put them in their historic ranking, like the ranking I would have given them a few years ago. Even though I feel like my love for authors 3 and 4 has been elevated sufficiently in recent years that they're all actually joint 2nd place. I don't think you really need to know about my rationale here, do you? But let's talk about Anthony Trollope in 4th place, but actually in joint 2nd. I love Anthony Trollope a lot. I'm holding up here The Small House at Allington, which is probably my favourite book by him. I had this crisis yesterday. My other favourite book by him, I'm going to hold it up as well to make up for my neglect of it yesterday. That is The Way We Live Now. I just love Anthony Trollope a lot, and I think he is an incredible writer. And he is the author I've now read the most by. I've read 41 of his books. Anthony Trollope is a fantastic writer who writes mostly realist fiction set in the Victorian period, dealing with people's lives and often with their romantic relationships. Sometimes with their successful romantic relationships, sometimes with the breakdown of their romantic relationships. He is an expert at a love triangle. He's an expert at 2 people want to get married, but society is getting in the way and there are money problems. He's an expert at an unrequited love story. He's an expert at an inheritance dispute. I love his inheritance disputes. And he writes about money and class and society in the Victorian period in such a wonderful way. His characterization is fantastic, his plotting is really interesting, his themes are fantastic, but I think the thing I love most about Anthony Trollope is his storytelling and how much I trust him as a storyteller, and therefore how much comfort his books bring me. Like, I just always have such a good time reading an Anthony Trollope book. Like, I just have such joy and fun when I read one of his novels. Reading his books is just like such a comfort read for me and such a pleasure. I love the way he writes, and I just find his books like such an utter joy. By the end of this year, I hope that I will have read all of his novels, and then I will do a massive ranking, and that will be excellent. Author number 3, who should also really be joint 2nd, is Elizabeth Gaskell. Elizabeth Gaskell actually is an author who is quite like Kazuo Ishiguro, which may seem like a weird comparison, but they're both very versatile, varied authors, and that's something that I really value in an author, I think. An author who writes a lot of different books, and I love them all. Elizabeth Gaskell wrote quite a lot of realism, set in the Victorian period about society, some of which is kind of quite industrial and gritty, like North and South, like her novel Mary Barton, some of which is a kind of gentler coming-of-age story, like Wives and Daughters, some of which is hilarious satire, like Cranford. But she also wrote lots of interesting Gothic stories, like her historical novel Lois the Witch, about the Salem witch trials. Some of her books are quite positive, but some of her books are also really dark and grim. You know, books like Sylvia's Lovers and Ruth feel much more Thomas Hardy-esque than the rest of Gaskell does, and crime and elements related to crime like often seep into her work in a really interesting way. There are Gaskell Gaskell books I would recommend for Austen fans, there are Gaskell books I would recommend for Dickens fans, and there are Gaskell books I would recommend for Hardy fans, and I think that's kind of really fun. I love her characterization, I love her plots, I love the clever way she explores her themes, the way she looks at grief and family and the complexities within family, the way she looks at class. And I know I just mentioned her characterization, but I'm going to mention it again because I think her characterization is absolutely superb, and so many of my favourite characters in all of literature are from Elizabeth Gaskell's work, and I just think that her books are truly, truly amazing. North and South, I think, is a great place to start with her books, and it is my favourite book by her and one of my favourite novels of all time. But I do also absolutely love Wives and Daughters, as I spoke about yesterday. I also absolutely love Cranford. I also love A Dark Knight's work. In general, I just really, really highly recommend Elizabeth Gaskell. I think her books are amazing. In second place, you know, kind of tied with Elizabeth Gaskell and Anthony Trollope, is of course Jane Austen, who is just great. I love Jane Austen a lot. I talk about Jane Austen so much on this channel that you probably don't need me to say that again, but I think her books are amazing. I've read them all many, many times. Every time I read them, I discover something new. I love how rereadable her books are. I love her sharp wit. I love her characterization and how subtle and intricate it is. You know, I think you only have to look at like the millions of retellings of like Pride and Prejudice alone to see what richness there is in this book that people want to interpret and pick apart. I love that every time I read a Jane Austen book, I spot something new, and I love that her books have grown on me over time, and changed from books that I like to books that I absolutely adore and that I find truly, truly fascinating. I love her love stories, of course, but I also love the way she explores money and family and class and the position of women in the early 19th century. I love her humour. Her books are absolutely hilarious for me. And in general, I just find Jane Austen, like Anthony Trollope, just such an utter joy to read. Like every time I read one of her books, I just have such a good time. My favourite is Pride and Prejudice, but I'm also going to hold up Mansfield Park, which is my second favourite book by her and I feel is very underrated. I do kind of get why people don't love Mansfield Park as much, but I do think if you go into Mansfield Park not expecting a love story and looking for something slightly different and a really interesting social critique novel, then I think you'll get a lot more out of it. And these are two books by Jane Austen that I love for kind of different reasons, I suppose. Saying that, I do think Pride and Prejudice is a much better place to start with Jane Austen. She is incredible. Please go and read her books if you haven't already. Please go and read all of her books if you've only read one. Please go and reread her books if you've already read them all, because they are such great rereads. I'm feeling very excited right now for Jane Austen July. But at number one, first place, my favourite author of all time, no surprise, is Charles Dickens, because I just think his books are great. Charles Dickens as well is an author who I have just loved for a very, very long time, and whose books like mean so much to me and I find so fascinating, and his books are so rich and interesting to me, and I've read them all his 14 and a half novels 2 or more times, with the exception of The Mystery of Edwin Drood, his final unfinished novel. I've only read that one twice, but all the rest I've read 3 times plus, and many of them I have read like 6, 7, 8 times. And every time I read them, they're just so great and they're so fun, and they're so complicated and dark and interesting, and I love the wild way that Dickens writes, and I love his massive tomes with so many different characters and so many different subplots weaving together. I love the eccentricity of so many of his characters, but also how he uses those eccentric characters to say real things about people and humanity. I love his themes. I love the way he looks at class and money and social mobility. I love the way that he criticises the world in which he lives and how he fights against so many things within the Victorian age that he found abhorrent. I love the way he writes about London. I love his humour. Like, I find Dickens hilarious. So funny. And I find his books so endlessly fascinating. Like, I feel like Charles Dickens is one of those authors where, like, even if there's a bit in his book that annoys me or that makes me cross, it always makes me cross in an interesting way, and I always find his books sort of just absolutely fascinating, I suppose. I have loved Dickens for a very long time. I first read Our Mutual Friend, my favourite novel of all time. It was my first Dickens novel, and I read that when I was, I guess, 13 or 14 years old. I then read all of the rest of Dickens's novels. I'd read all of them by the time I was 18, because I was a cool teenager. And I have just read and reread them ever since, and I find them endlessly fascinating, and I think I always will. For 2 years, until last year, if that makes sense. I was hosting a read-along of Charles Dickens, where we were reading all of his books in publication order, the Mega Dickens read-along, which I had so much fun with, and it was just such a joy to reread all of his books in order and think about all the things I find fascinating about them and kind of dissect all of his books in a really interesting way. I also listened to them all on audiobook. He works so well on audiobook for me. He's such like a comfort listen writer. And there's just so much that I love about Dickens. I feel like we could be here for a very long time with me rambling about how much I love Charles Dickens and how much I love Our Mutual Friend, which I already did yesterday, so I won't do that anymore. If you want to know where to start with Charles Dickens, I said I wouldn't do that anymore. I'm still rambling about Dickens. If you want to know where to start with Charles Dickens, I recommend Great Expectations mostly, and also David Copperfield, but mostly Great Expectations. The reason why I recommend those two books is because they are in first person, so you're always following one character, which I think really helps with getting into Dickens at the beginning, because a lot of his long books have a lot of characters and it can feel a bit confusing, whereas if you read Great Expectations of David Copperfield and you're following one person, it just feels a bit easier. Like, even if you are meeting a lot of characters, you at least know who the main one is. So I recommend those two as the place to start, especially Great Expectations, because I think it is the slightly stronger one. Anyway, I love Dickens a lot. I've made many videos about Dickens, so if you want to know more about my love for Dickens, you know, search Dickens in my video history and there are many videos. Okay, I've been rambling for quite a while about my favorite authors, so I think I will finish this video here. But there we go. Those are my 10 favorite authors, plus, you know, some honorable mentions because I'm not good at short lists. Do let me know down in the comments. Do you have some favorite authors of all time? Could you pick a top 10? Who would they be? And what do you think of these authors? Are there any that you know and love? Are there any that you're keen to read in the future? That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back tomorrow with another bookish video.